56-year-old Greg Wolf backed his dusty old Jeep down the driveway and headed towards one of his favorite places, the garden center. Ever since the COVID pandemic started, his work had slowed down, so he had a lot more time on his hands for hobbies like gardening. As he cruised along the winding road, he thought about what he might want to plant. Every year, he liked to mix it up and try a few new fruits, flowers, or vegetables. Greg stopped at a red light and let his mind wander, picturing different layouts for his garden. When the light turned green, Greg put his foot on the gas pedal, but just as he entered the intersection, a black truck came barreling toward him. There was an explosion of crunching metal and shattered glass. Greg felt a blinding pain rip through his spine as his car spun across the road. And then everything went black. Three days later, Greg lay on his stomach in an operating room under fluorescent lights. Just minutes earlier, an anesthesiologist had shot him full of lidocaine to numb his spine for surgery. And as he began to feel the medicine kicking in, it occurred to him that this was actually the first time he had not been in pain since the car accident. Even though Greg had been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash, the impact of the crash had broken a vertebrae in his back. He'd been in the hospital for days while doctors did everything they could to try to stabilize his injury. Once he'd regained consciousness following the crash, doctors told Greg that he was very lucky. The accident could have been much worse. Greg had suffered what's known as a stable fracture. This meant that when his vertebrae cracked, it stayed in the same place rather than being knocked out of alignment. So the nerve endings in Greg's spinal column were not affected. If they had been, Greg could have been paralyzed. To relieve his pain, Greg's doctors had decided to perform a surgery called kyphoplasty, which corrects small fractures like the one in his vertebrae. This was the surgery he was being prepped for right now. A few minutes later, the doctor arrived and greeted Greg and walked him through what was going to happen. Greg was going to remain conscious during the procedure. Then, after Greg acknowledged that he was ready to go, Greg felt the doctor's hands on his back, followed by a dull pressure as a large, hollow needle entered his spine. After the needle was in place, the doctor inserted a balloon-like device into Greg's vertebrae through the needle and gently inflated it until it opened up a small space in the bone. Into this space, the doctor then injected a special type of liquid cement. As the cement settled in the cracked vertebrae, it hardened and bonded against the bone. This would stabilize Greg's spine while staying flexible enough to allow him a full range of motion. And critically, it would also help reduce Greg's pain. Within a week, the doctor said he'd be feeling like his old self. Greg felt the pressure in his back start to fade as the doctor withdrew the needle from his spine. A few minutes later, a nurse came in and wheeled Greg down the hall to a recovery room to rest. As the anesthesia began to wear off, Greg did feel soreness in his spine, but the pain was mild. And after what he'd been through, this felt like a gift. A few hours later, as Greg got dressed and ready to go home, the surgeon came by to check on him. He recommended that Greg only take showers, not baths, for a few days to allow the wound on his back to heal, and he should avoid any heavy lifting for at least a week. But otherwise, his life would be just like before the surgery. Riding home from the hospital with his wife, Greg felt like he had miraculously avoided a tragedy. Now, he could get back to enjoying his life. But, only 7 days later, Greg was back in the emergency room. Everything hurt. His chest, his neck, his jaw. Even turning his head sent shivers of pain rippling through his body. The first few days back at home had been fine. He was able to take walks and cook, even do a little gardening, but on the 5th day, he began to feel this new kind of pain in his chest. Following the doctor's advice, Greg checked his wound from the surgery to see if it was infected. But the wound looked fine, so he decided to turn in early that night and hope he would feel better in the morning. However, over the next 2 days, Greg's pain only spread. Greg tried to relax and avoided doing anything strenuous, but almost any movement, even just turning his head, hurt like crazy. He thought he felt well enough to weed his garden, and that's when the pain suddenly became almost blinding. It was so intense that Greg thought he was having a heart attack. And so now he was lying on a bed in an emergency room, trying not to move a muscle. The pain still flickered through his chest and neck. He could barely breathe. Greg had never felt anything like this. It felt even worse than what he imagined a heart attack was like. Greg just hoped that whatever was happening, it was not too late to fix it. ER doctor Miranda Gibbs was just coming back from lunch when an X-ray technician stopped her in the hallway with an update. there was something seriously wrong with her new patient, Greg Wolf. She followed the technician to his office and looked at Greg's x-rays displayed on his computer. Greg's spine looked fine. His recent kyphoplasty surgery had clearly repaired his cracked vertebrae. But something else she saw in Greg's x-ray disturbed her. Dr. Gibbs pulled out her phone and called the medical imaging department. She told them she needed to book a CT scan for her patient immediately. 2 hours later, the images had been processed and were ready for her inspection. Sitting in her office, Dr. Gibbs struggled to comprehend what she was even looking at. She grabbed the phone and called the ER. She hoped there was a trauma surgeon on duty or somewhere nearby, because Greg Wolf was a pinprick away from disaster. An hour later, Greg was on his back, unconscious. His chest had been surgically opened. A surgeon leaned over him, looking in at Greg's heart. The surgeon maneuvered until he found what he was looking for. A long, thin 4-inch object. It had pierced through the upper right chamber of Greg's heart and also cut into his right lung. This is what Dr. Gibbs had seen in the images of Greg's chest. Now, the strange object was just sitting there, simultaneously poking Greg in the heart and lung. The surgeon steadied himself and carefully gripped the object with his tool. Any abrupt movement could cause a tear in Greg's heart or lung. The damage could be fatal. As he began to pull the object out, the surgeon was surprised at how hard the object was. It was like a stone, pale, pointed, and slightly curved. Little by little, the surgeon pulled the hard little dagger out from Greg's organs, until finally it was free. Examining it in the light, it looked a bit like one of those heavy-duty needles used to repair upholstery or carpet, except it was made of medical-grade cement. It would turn out, during Greg's back surgery, a small splash of the liquid cement had leaked out of his vertebrae into his body. Once there, it hardened into a sliver and basically followed through Greg's bloodstream, eventually reaching his heart. Greg's sudden stabs of pain he was feeling were from the tip of the cement needle piercing his heart. His trouble breathing was the needle literally poking his lung. If he had waited even 24 more hours to go to the ER, the needle could have stabbed him even more deeply and potentially killed him. Fortunately, doctors were able to repair the tear in Greg's heart and his lung, and after being sewn back up, he made a quick recovery. Only 1 month later, Greg Wolf was back in his garden in full health. He had dodged 2 near-death experiences in 2 weeks, and he had no intention of trying for a third. And now here's our second story called Killer Fashion. On a cold, clear afternoon in February of 2000, after a long, bumpy ride through snow-capped mountains, 15-year-old Amet stepped off a bus into the city center of Erzurum, Turkey. The urban bustle was a culture shock for a country kid like him. He had spent his whole life in the small Turkish village where he was born, helping his family tend land and herd livestock. But 2 weeks earlier, Amet's uncle had found him a job in a textile factory in Erzurum. So here he was, surrounded by cars and buses and people, with businesses and cafes stretching down every block. It was a lot for Amet to process, but he was thrilled to be in this new environment and to start this exciting new chapter. He grabbed his bag from the bus's luggage compartment and headed straight for his new job. As he walked through the city, Amet had to stop every few blocks to catch his breath. Erzurum was a high, mountainous city, and so the air was thinner up there. He could feel the difference in his lungs. Eventually, Amet found the factory, walked inside, and introduced himself. His boss gave him a quick tour of the facility. As they walked around, Amet saw long rows of industrial looms and conveyor belts loaded with fabric, and he also saw another part of the building that was filled with workers hunched over sewing machines. Then, Amet followed his boss to a back area of the factory where narrow pallets were clustered in a corner. The man told him that that was actually where many of the workers without families would sleep, since the hours were long and the factory was a good distance from most residential areas. Now, Amet really needed this job to work, and he would do whatever it took. So he smiled and tossed his bag on one of the pallets and followed his boss to begin his training. 4.5 years later, in July of 2004, Amet wiped the sweat from his face as he paced the crowded waiting room of a government hospital. He was 19 years old, but he felt much older. His life at the factory had been a whirlwind, getting up at dawn, shuffling to the assembly line, then sewing and finishing garments until dark. He and a couple other workers shared an apartment near the city center, but some nights he was too tired to make the walk back. So on those nights, he just curled up on the floor of the factory until it was time to get up and start the next day's shift. And before long, the late nights and early mornings began to take their toll. His sleep got worse, which only made the days feel longer. Amet also developed a bad cough, and gradually it got so severe that he began waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. The exhaustion also affected his appetite, and he started losing weight. And this only made Amet feel weaker and more fatigued. It was a vicious cycle. A year earlier, in the fall of 2003, his condition had gotten so bad that he began making mistakes at work. He confused the measurements of seams and hems. He skipped entire steps of the production process. In November of that year, some shops complained about the quality of their orders, and the errors were traced back to Amet. When Amet's boss confronted him about the problem, Amet tried to pass it off as an accident, but Amet's boss could tell something deeper was wrong. So he removed Amet from the work schedule until his health improved. Without a job, Amet felt lost. His small amount of savings quickly dwindled. Amet tried to find other work, but Erzurum was full of young men who were hungry for similar jobs. And since Amet looked visibly ill, most employers turned him away. Amet had been able to scrape by on savings through the winter, but by the spring of 2004, Amet was broke. His roommates tried to be understanding, but told Amet that he would have to move out if he couldn't keep up with his share of the rent. And so, if Amet couldn't find a job soon, he would soon have no choice but to move back to his family's home in the country. Unfortunately, Amet's time away from the factory did not improve his health. He was still sleeping poorly, he felt run down, dizzy, and exhausted, and then one scorching summer morning in July, Amet woke up so out of breath that he couldn't even make it to a job interview he had booked. He realized something serious might be wrong with him. So Amet took a cold shower, threw on clothes, and dragged himself to the government hospital across town. Now here he was, weak and lightheaded, pacing a waiting room full of sick people. An hour later, a nurse called Amet's name. He was taken to a treatment room where a tired-looking doctor listened while Amet described his symptoms. When he was done, the doctor told Amet he most likely had tuberculosis, commonly called TB, a contagious bacterial disease of the lungs. For hundreds of years, TB had been one of the world's deadliest diseases. But thanks to the development of antibiotics in the 20th century, it was now a very treatable illness. The doctor guessed that Amet had caught TB in the factory, since the disease spreads easily in confined spaces. All it takes is being near the wrong cough or sneeze. The doctor said that most likely the disease had lingered in his lungs ever since. Amet was surprised by the diagnosis, especially considering the doctor didn't actually run any tests. But it seemed like an obvious enough explanation, and he was honestly just relieved to have an explanation at all for his trouble breathing and fatigue. And so the doctor prescribed Amet medication that would stop the TB from being contagious within 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that, all of Amet's symptoms would be gone. Amet was thrilled. If the doctor was right, he could be back in the factory within a month, making his full wages again. He wouldn't have to move back home after all. Even better, he would finally stop coughing and be able to sleep through the entire night. 1 month later, in August of 2004, a pulmonologist named Dr. Yusuf Kaya went to meet a new patient at the Ataturk University Clinic in Erzurum. The patient was a 19-year-old factory worker named Amet. He reported having trouble breathing, a painful cough, and intense fatigue. As soon as Dr. Kaya stepped into the treatment room, he could tell from the teenager's face alone that something was deeply wrong. Amet's skin looked waxy and sickly. It looked like he'd barely slept in days. Amet explained to Dr. Kaya that he had been taking TB antibiotics for a full month, but hadn't seen any sign of improvement. He felt weak and run down, and no matter how deeply he tried to breathe, he just couldn't get enough air. Dr. Kaya found this very worrying. If Amet had TB, then the antibiotics definitely should have helped him by now. But since his body was not responding, Dr. Kaya wondered what else might be causing Amet's symptoms. The doctor placed a stethoscope on Amet's chest. The teenager's heartbeat was normal, however, his breathing sounded shallow. Dr. Kaya told Amet that he wanted to run some tests to figure out why the TB medication was not working. He proposed starting with an X-ray of Amet's chest, followed by a full-body CT scan to provide a more detailed 3D rendering of Amet's organs. After that, Dr. Kaya suggested doing a bronchoscopy, which uses a thin, illuminated tube to examine the lungs and airways. Separately, he also wanted to test Amet's blood, mucus, and saliva for disease or infection. Amet told Dr. Kaya that his number one goal was getting back to his job at the factory. So whatever was necessary to make that happen, Dr. Kaya should do it. A few days later, after all the tests had been performed, Dr. Kaya opened a link on his computer to inspect Amet's results. And what he saw made him very concerned. Amet's chest x-ray looked speckled, particularly in his lungs. This indicated the presence of small foreign objects in Amet's lungs that shouldn't be there. His CT scan was more detailed. In addition to the foreign objects, it showed small growths in his lungs known as micronodules, which are often caused by respiratory illnesses or infections. And a culture test of his phlegm confirmed that Amet did not have TB. Dr. Kaya had suspected this when Amet's TB treatment didn't have any effect, but it was a relief to see it medically proven. But even so, ruling out TB didn't get Dr. Kaya any closer to figuring out what was causing Amet's symptoms. The cumulative picture provided by Amet's tests indicated that there was some sort of serious infection in his lungs. It just wasn't clear what that might be. So Dr. Kaya canceled Amet's TB medication and replaced it with a more general antibiotic. Dr. Kaya hoped this would ease Amet's symptoms, but he knew antibiotics wouldn't fix anything. Until he identified the infection in Amet's lungs, it wouldn't go away, and it very well might get worse. He just didn't know how much worse. Amet was already struggling to breathe, and less oxygen in his lungs meant less oxygen to his brain. And if that trend continued, things could get very bad very quickly. A few weeks later, Dr. Kaya was scanning the paperwork of the clinic's latest patients when something caught his eye. It was the intake form of a young man named Ali. He was 18, only a year younger than Amet, and suffering from very similar symptoms. Struggling to breathe, dry mouth, bad cough, unusual fatigue. Dr. Kaya decided to pay him a visit at the clinic. Maybe Ali could provide a clue as to what was making Amet so sick. After introducing himself, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to describe the history of his symptoms. And right away, one detail surprised him. Ali worked at the same garment factory as Amet. Dr. Kaya wondered why two otherwise healthy young men would have breathing issues or lung infections at their age. Neither of them smoked, and they spent their days doing physical labor, which in theory should have made them stronger, not weaker. Taking a seat by Ali's bed, Dr. Kaya asked Ali to walk him through a regular day at the factory. The jobs he did, the machines he used, what he ate, all of it. Ali explained that he started at the factory doing heavy labor, like loading and unloading fabric from the trucks to the machines and back. But over time, he was trained to do more skilled work, putting the finishing touches on garments before they were shipped to shops around the world. Ali and Amet's factory produced contemporary clothing for the latest fashion trends of the 2000s. Some of their factory's techniques were extremely new to the industry, and they sounded pretty strange to the doctor. But as Ali described his responsibilities, Dr. Kaya began to get an idea. And by the end of their chat, Dr. Kaya felt confident that he actually knew what was happening to both Ali and Amet. However, to be certain, he would need to examine samples of Ali and Amet's lung tissue under a microscope, and so he ordered lung biopsies for both men. Days later, the lung tissue samples confirmed Dr. Kaya's hunch. Both men were suffering from silicosis, a disease more commonly found in miners than garment factory workers. It's a lung disease caused by breathing silica, which is a common mineral in sand, gravel, clay, granite, and other rocks. Dr. Kaya had diagnosed cases of silicosis before, but only in workers who spent their days in tunnels or moving heavy stone materials and breathing in all kinds of rock dust. He would never have thought textile factory workers would have silicosis, since their product was fabric, not rock. But fashion tastes had changed in Europe and America in the early 2000s. One of the most popular and profitable items that Amet and Ali's factory produced was something called distressed jeans, and making them involved a lot of rock dust. To create the hip, faded denim look, workers used a high-pressure air compressor to blast sand up and down the legs of a pair of jeans. The silica particles in the sand gradually shredded the denim, giving the jeans a worn-in, weathered look. Like a lot of factories in Turkey at the time, Amet and Ali's workplace was crowded and lacked proper ventilation. This meant the silica particles stayed in the air long after the jeans were sandblasted. And so Amet and Ali breathed these particles in all day. And then at night, if they slept on the factory floor, they would continue to breathe in the silica during their sleep. Over time, the tiny crystals of silica scar and harden the delicate tissues in the lungs, making them less effective at processing oxygen. That's why the men's breathing became increasingly shallow. Sadly, silicosis damage is permanent, and it often leads to other respiratory illnesses. Lung cancer is a common outcome, and there is no cure. Even after Dr. Kaya identified Amet and Ali's condition, their health steadily worsened, and in 2008, both young men died from silicosis complications. And they were not alone either. 4 other workers at the same factory died as well, and 16 others suffered debilitating lung damage. In March of the following year, Turkey's Ministry of Health banned denim sandblasting, and thankfully, sandblasted jeans quickly fell out of fashion. In the early morning hours of March 11th, 1989, 4 young men who were all in their 20s and all very close friends left their homes in East Texas and headed south. 9 hours later, they arrived in the beautiful resort town of South Padre Island, which is just off the coast of southern Texas. They were there to enjoy their spring break by sunning on the beach, drinking in bars, and meeting girls. When they finally arrived that night, they were so exhausted from the trip that they went right to bed. The next morning, when they got up, they went straight down to the beach and they had some drinks. And then by the afternoon, they were talking amongst themselves and they decided that for their first full night of being on vacation, they would kick things off with a bang and they would go into Mexico and party there. And so they piled into their car and they drove an hour southwest to Brownsville, Texas, which is a town that sits right on the border of Mexico. And when they got there, they parked their car and then walked right over the footbridge that crossed the Rio Grande River into Mexico. On the other side, in Mexico, they found themselves in the town of Matamoros, which is very popular amongst spring break goers for their bars and their clubs. And so the 4 friends got a quick bite to eat at a hamburger joint, and then they made their way into the bars and the clubs, and they danced and they drank for hours. And then at some point, they got tired and left the bar scene. They crossed over the footbridge back into the US and made their way back to their hotel in South Padre Island. The next morning, when they got up and they recovered from their hangover, they decided they had so much fun in Matamoros the night before that they had to go back. And so that night, they piled back into their car, they drove back down to Brownsville, Texas, they crossed over that footbridge into Mexico, and then all night they partied and danced and had a great time. And then at some point, the 4 decided it was time to leave, and so they left their bar and began walking towards the footbridge. But that night, it was so crowded in Matamoros that you could barely move a foot without bumping into someone. And so the foursome split into 2 separate pairs. And the lead pair, they made their way ahead and they stopped at the gift shop right at the foot of that bridge going back to the US side, and there they waited for the trail pair. The trail pair, which consisted of Mark Kilroy and Bill Huddleston, they weren't far behind, but they got sidetracked when Mark saw a girl standing next to a house that he had seen earlier in the night, and he just wanted to go up and talk to her and say bye to her. And so they go over to this girl, and while Mark is talking to her, Bill moves on ahead and goes down an alleyway to urinate, and then when he comes back out, Mark and this girl are not there. Bill assumed Mark must have just moved on the little ways up to the bridge where the other 2 friends were at the gift shop, and so after looking around for just a couple of seconds, Bill makes his way up to the bridge and he meets up with the other 2 friends. And when he gets there, he asks the other 2 friends, where's Mark? Did he come up here already? And they say, no, we haven't seen him. And so now the trio's a little bit concerned, but they're thinking, okay, he must be with this girl he had seen. And so they backtracked a little ways and they looked for Mark. They went back to where he had been talking to that girl, and again, he wasn't there. And so they decided, okay, he must have already crossed the bridge and made it to our car, and he's probably just waiting for us over there. And so the trio crosses over the bridge into the US side, they get to their car, and Mark's not there. And so at this point, they are pretty concerned about Mark, but they eventually convince themselves that he must have just left with this girl, and they probably are back at the hotel together. And so after a little while, the trio decides, let's just go back to the hotel, we're bound to find Mark. And so they drive all the way back to South Padre Island, they get to their hotel room and Mark's not there, but again, they tell themselves he's not here because he's probably with this girl in another room, and so they don't worry about him, they go to bed, but the next morning, when Mark still had not come back to the hotel room, they decide, you know what, something's wrong here, we have to tell police. And so they file a missing person report, but the police get so many of these about spring breakers who go missing in Matamoros that they don't really take them seriously at first, because typically the missing person will just show up 24 hours later with a horrible hangover and no memory of how they got back from Matamoros. And so the police were expecting this to happen with Mark, but after 24 hours, when Mark didn't show up with a bad hangover, they were convinced that something had happened to him, and American and Mexican police suspected foul play because Matamoros and the surrounding areas are not exactly safe for tourists, but they didn't have any leads, and so Mark's case languished. 3 weeks later, a drug smuggler drove through a police checkpoint without stopping just outside of Matamoros. And so the police pursued him, and this guy ultimately stopped at this secluded ranch up in the mountains. After the police arrested the smuggler, they noticed a ranch worker was standing nearby, and on a whim, they showed him a picture of Mark and said, "Hey, have you seen this guy?" And the worker, despite being scared and not really sure what to do, he said to police, "Yeah, I have seen him here. The smuggler and his friends, they brought him here in handcuffs." And then the worker turned around and pointed up the mountain towards the shack that was about 400 yards up the mountain, and he said that's where they took him. And so authorities began walking up the hillside towards the shack, and when they got about 100 yards away, they saw this big metal cauldron sitting on the front stoop of the shack. And then when they got about 50 yards away, they were hit with this horrible smell of death and decay. And then when they got right up in front of the shack and could see inside of this cauldron and inside of the shack itself, what they saw was so gruesome and horrible that even the most senior and grizzled responding officers were totally shaken up by it. Under intense questioning, the drug smuggler that had originally led police up to the secluded ranch and the shack admitted that he was a part of a gang and that his gang had taken Mark. 3 weeks earlier, while Bill was urinating in that alleyway, Mark spoke to that girl he wanted to see, and then she went off, and then Mark was left standing alone waiting for Bill to come back. And while he was waiting, a man on the street parked in a red truck yelled out to him to come over. He needed help or something. He lured him to the truck. And so Mark went over to the truck, and then right when he asked the man, what do you need? 2 men, one of which included this drug smuggler, jumped out from behind a building and tried to grab Mark and put him inside of this red truck. Mark was a very fit, big, athletic guy, and so he was able to fight the 2 men off and then took off running down the road. But he only made it about 2 blocks when another car full of gangsters showed up, cut him off, and then at gunpoint got him to come into the second vehicle. And so once he was restrained inside of this vehicle, they drove him out of the town of Matamoros onto some backcountry roads up into the mountains to this secluded ranch where they left him overnight in the car. The next morning, the gang members came back out and they wrapped duct tape around Mark's mouth and his whole face and his eyes. They just left a little slit around his nostrils so he could breathe. And then they pulled him out of the vehicle with his hands tied behind his back, and they walked him up the hill to that shack. This gang that had abducted Mark, that this drug smuggler was a part of, was more like a cult. And this cult was led by a man named Constanzo, who practiced a form of black magic called Palo. Constanzo would perform Palo rituals, which he claimed to his followers would make he and all of them invincible. These rituals, which took place in the shack up in the mountains, involved human sacrifice. Constanzo would tell his followers that these people who were going to be sacrificed, they didn't just need to die, they needed to die screaming. Because Constanzo believed the more agony he inflicted on his victims before they ultimately died and were sacrificed to the gods, the more power the gods would grant to he and his followers. And so the people who got kidnapped and marched up to that shack to be sacrificed were subjected to unspeakable atrocities, and Mark had been selected to be the next ritual sacrifice. After Mark was led out of the vehicle with his face all taped up, he was walked up to that shack where he spent several horrifying hours with Constanzo and his cronies, and then at some point Mark was killed when a machete was brought down on the back of his neck. Afterwards, Mark's brain was removed and placed into their sacred cauldron and boiled, and then Mark's legs were removed, and then a long wire was inserted into Mark's torso and fished around inside of him until they hooked it onto his spinal column, and then they buried his torso and his legs, and they left that wire protruding from his body up out of the dirt. There was basically a lead poking out of the ground, and the reason they did that was because later on, they could just pull on that wire and pull up Mark's bones and use his bones to make jewelry. Mark's body was one of 15 discovered in and around this shack. The total number of people that Constanzo and his cult ritualistically murdered is at least 16, but believed to be closer to 26. However, the police were not able to get the official number from Constanzo because Constanzo had his followers shoot and kill him before the police could get to him. 5 other cult members were ultimately convicted for their roles in the cult's murders, and they were each given a sentence of over 60 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Most Feared Girl in Mexico. The Sierra Madre Oriental is a major mountain range that starts on the southern border of Texas and Mexico and cuts 700 miles south through the northeastern section of Mexico. About halfway down this mountain range on the eastern face lies a series of caves. And situated below these caves at the foot of the mountains are several small villages that are very isolated, and they're populated primarily with illiterate poor farmers. One night back in May of 1963, a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero, who lived in one of these small isolated villages, decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. Now, this was something he did fairly regularly because there was a local rumor that there was actually hidden treasure in these different caves. Now, it's unclear if Sebastian literally believed that or if that was just kind of an excuse to go have a look around himself. But regardless, he headed out of his house and he began walking up the mountain towards these caves. The entrance to these caves were a couple hundred feet up the mountainside, and then each of the various entrances, which ranged in size from fairly small to enormous, were spread out a couple of miles in each direction. So Sebastian starts walking up the mountain towards the first entrance he can see. It's dark outside, he's got no flashlight, he's just walking up, and as he's walking, he notices off to his right, fairly far away from where he was, there was light coming out of one of the cave entrances. And he had never recalled seeing light coming out of any of these caves. Nobody ever went in these caves, especially not at night. And so his interest was piqued, and he decided he would kind of abandon his original plan to just kind of look around near his village, and he would actually walk all the way over to that lit up cave and see what was going on. So he turned right and began kind of walking uphill at an angle in the direction of this lit up cave. And so as he's walking, he's getting farther and farther away from the village where he lives, and he's starting to hear sounds coming out of this lit up cave entrance. It sounds like a person potentially, either they're laughing or they're screaming. He doesn't really know. He's thinking, maybe someone's having a party inside one of these caves. He has no idea. But after he gets maybe 200 or 300 feet away from this entrance, he realizes it's definitely a person, and they're definitely screaming. And it does not sound like they're screaming out of joy. It sounds like they're screaming because they're scared or they're in pain. And as he's getting closer and closer and closer to this cave, his anxiety is starting to ramp up because he's really starting to be frightened by what he's hearing, and he's starting to realize there's more than one person inside of this cave. In addition to the person that is screaming out, there also sounds to be a large contingent of other people that are either singing in unison or chanting in unison, but some group of people are doing something in unison while some other person is screaming out. And so he's really starting to get nervous about this cave, but he just can't help feeling curious about what was going on. And so he just continued walking until he was maybe 10 feet away from the entrance to this cave, and he plopped down behind a rock. And so he's not really sure if it's a good idea to look. He doesn't want to be spotted by whoever is in there. But finally, he kind of works up the courage. He takes a deep breath and he slips out from behind the rock and he goes right to the edge of this big opening, maybe 10 foot across opening. And he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening and he looks inside. And what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. Then his survival instincts just kick in and he turns and he starts running down the mountain away from this cave. He has no idea if he's been spotted or not, but he's sensing that someone could be chasing him. And so he is just running as if his life depended on it. And he would not run back to his village. Instead, he would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. And when he gets there, he busts through the front doors and he's totally hysterical. He's drenched in sweat and the police officers are totally caught off guard. And so they're trying to tell him to calm down. And so Sebastian finally would kind of compose himself, but then he just was not able to describe what he had seen inside of this cave. Whatever he had seen, he knew it was bad, but the words were just escaping him. And so the way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. And as soon as he began describing vampires to the police, they're thinking to themselves, okay, I don't know what's going on with this kid, but this just cannot be serious. And so they consoled him and kind of calmed him down and said, look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about. If there's any news that comes out of something happening in the cave that's bad, I'm sure we'll hear about it and we'll follow up. But for now, we're just going to bring you back to your village. And so at this, Sebastian was really frustrated and he was kind of pleading with the police like, no, you got to take me seriously. There's something bad happening in this cave. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be dying. I don't know, but you gotta go to this cave. You gotta go see what's going on. But the police at this point, they're just not really interested. And so they ultimately do just drive him back to his village. And so he goes back into his home. The police go back to their station and everyone just kind of goes to bed for the night. The next day, when Sebastian wakes up, he just can't shake what he saw inside of that cave. And so he would once again run back to the police station. And when he got there, he began pleading with the police, like, you gotta go see what's inside of this cave. I'm telling you, there's something awful in there. And this time, one of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, okay, kid, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. And so Luis and Sebastian, who was very grateful, they left the police station, they hopped in a police car, and they took off. And then, later on in the day, the other police officers, who were not really paying attention to this cave thing, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet, and Luis had not checked in via his radio. And so at some point in the afternoon that day, the other officers began calling out to Luis. They began calling him on his radio and trying to figure out what's going on, but he wasn't responding. And so the police thought that was odd, but they thought, you know what, I'm sure he'll be back soon. There's got to be an explanation for this. But the rest of the day would go by without Luis reaching out to them, and he didn't return with the boy. And so by that evening, the other officers were genuinely concerned that, something bad had happened to their colleague. And so they tried calling Luis a few more times on the radio. It didn't work. And so the officers, they made their way over to Sebastian's village, and they found Sebastian's family, believing that, maybe the boy was back and he could give some insight into where Luis went. But when they talked to Sebastian's family, they would say, hey, he's not back yet either. And so both Sebastian and Luis at this point have not talked to anyone all day, and they are missing. And so the police at this point, they realized this is an emergency. They need to figure out where these two went. And so they were kind of understaffed. And so they contacted the Mexican army, and they explained, we're missing one of our colleagues. We're missing a child from this village. And so the Mexican army would actually send out a military unit to assist them in going and finding these two people. And so the unit, they show up later that night, and the police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. To understand what was found inside of this cave, we need to go back 6 months to December of 1962. That month, two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, who made their living basically traveling around Mexico, stealing from people and swindling people, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. They were going to rip off an entire town. Their plan was to go into a small, fairly isolated village that was populated primarily with poor and illiterate people, and they would go in there and they would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god, and if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so the village the brothers identified as their target was a place called La Yerba Buena, which was located right at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental, right below where that cave was that Luis and Sebastian went to investigate. And La Yerba Buena was exactly what the brothers were looking for. It was home to only about 20 families that were all very poor and illiterate, and they were very suggestible. And so right before the new year, the Hernandez brothers strolled into La Yerba Buena, and they put on this very dramatic show explaining how they were the prophets of the Incan god. And these two brothers, they were very charismatic and they were excellent salesmen. And so they really sold the lie. And these villagers, who were very vulnerable and cut off really from the rest of the world, they believed them. They thought this was their big break. They're going to be rich. We just have to do whatever they say. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. They would give them anything they wanted and do anything they wanted. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers, the prophets, because it seemed like they were not really working towards making the villagers rich. Instead, it just seemed like they were horribly mistreating the villagers. And it just didn't feel like this was a relationship that was benefiting the villagers. And so when this sentiment began to kind of make its way around the 70-ish people who lived in La Yerba Buena, the brothers picked up on it, and they could have, at that point, just kind of abandoned their gig. At this point, they've robbed the town dry. There's nothing left for them to give to the brothers. But for whatever reason, the brothers decide instead to salvage their operation. And so the brothers, they leave the village and they go to a city that's relatively close by, and they recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis. She was a prostitute, and they tell her, hey, we have this con we're doing in La Yerba Buena where we're pretending to be prophets of this Incan god, and they're starting not to believe our lie, and so we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious, that we have a direct line to the Incan gods and goddesses, and they'll believe us again, and they'll fall back in line. And so Magdalena, she likes the idea of participating in this con, and so she agrees to do it in exchange for some money. And so she, along with the Hernandez brothers and Magdalena's brother, his name was Eliezer, and he functioned as her pimp, those 4 people, they went back to Yerba Buena. And when they got there, the Hernandez brothers snuck Magdalena past all the villagers up to that cave up in the mountains. And they put her in the back of the cave, they kind of hid her behind some rocks, and they dressed her up in an Incan goddess costume. And then once she was in there, the brothers went back down to the village and they rounded all the villagers up and said, come on, let's go up to the cave. We have a special ceremony for you. And so the villagers made their way up to this cave, and once they were all inside, the Hernandez brothers used some basic magic tricks and created basically a smoke screen. Once they had the smoke screen kind of billowing in the back of the cave, they secretly signaled to Magdalena, who was behind the smoke screen, and she knew that was her cue, and she leapt through the smoke and she presented herself to the villagers for the first time, and she declared herself to be a reincarnated Incan goddess. And if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you. And so the message she was sending to the villagers was so intense, they completely believed that this was an Incan goddess, and therefore this was not a ruse. The brothers were not lying to them. This was all very real. There's a real goddess in front of us. And so they immediately fell right back in line. The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for, and that was what Magdalena did next. Even though Magdalena was fully aware that what she was getting herself into was an act, it was a con, it was not real, despite that, as soon as she jumped through the smoke and was standing in front of the villagers for the first time and saw the looks on these people's faces as they stared up at her, and she saw their reverence for her, it had this profound impact on her. This is a woman who's never had control in her life. She's been a prostitute since a young age, and here she is, the most powerful person in the room, and it's not even close. And it got to her head. And so when she left the cave that night, she literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess. And she was not a merciful one. Within the first few days of her stay at La Yerba Buena, Magdalena used threats of violence on the villagers to completely take over the village. She very easily supplanted the Hernandez brothers at the top of the power structure. Now, the Hernandez brothers probably were quite surprised to see this happen because they were expecting Magdalena to play more of a prop role to keep them in power, not the other way around. But ultimately, they kind of just went along with it because through Magdalena's control over the villagers, they were able to continue to exploit the villagers, and so they were getting what they wanted out of this relationship. Within a few weeks of being in La Yerba Buena, Magdalena was not only abusing every villager in every horrible way imaginable, she also was becoming completely delusional. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so she demanded all the villagers provide her with blood. And so in fear of retribution, the villagers began slaughtering all of their farm animals and their own pets so Magdalena could drink their blood. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the horrible abuse Magdalena would dole out on the villagers would continue, and these blood rituals would continue. And then finally, sometime in April, 2 of the villagers decided, you know what, I've had enough. I don't believe Magdalena is actually an Incan goddess. I don't believe the Hernandez brothers are actually prophets. I think this is all a scam. And so they decided the way they would handle this is they were just going to flee the village. Now, somehow their plans to run away got out, and the Hernandez brothers found out about it, and they, in turn, told Magdalena about it, and when she heard the news, she immediately told everyone in the village to make their way up to the cave for a special ceremony. So all the villagers, including the 2 people that were planning on running away, they made their way up to the cave, and once everyone was inside, Magdalena walked to the front of the group and she pointed at the two dissenters, the two people that were planning on running, and she demanded that the rest of the villagers kill them. And on the spot, all of the other villagers jumped on top of the two dissenters and they lynched them. They beat them to death in the cave. And then after these two people have been killed, Magdalena orders their bodies be strung up on these two pikes she had set up in the back of the cave because she knew what she was going to be doing up in this cave. And so after these two bodies were strung up on these pikes, Magdalena grabs a chalice and she walks over to these two bodies and she presses the chalice up against their bodies where they're bleeding from, and she fills it up and then she drinks from the chalice. And at this point, everything changed. Suddenly, Magdalena understood that it wasn't good enough to just be drinking animal blood. That was not enough to keep her, a goddess, alive. She now could only consume human blood. And so for the next several weeks, periodically, Magdalena would order everyone in the village to go back up to the cave for a blood ritual, which they all knew what this entailed. This no longer had anything to do with animals. This was human blood rituals. She would order them up and they would have no idea who was going to be the sacrifice. And so all these people that get inside this dark cave, and then Magdalena shows up and she stands in front of them, and after kind of looking them over, she identifies her next sacrifice, and out of fear, the other villagers, who were the friends and family of the victim, would launch themselves on top of the chosen sacrifice and lynch them in the cave. And then afterwards, their body would be strung up on one of the pikes, and Magdalena would walk over with her chalice, she would fill it with blood, and she would drink it. And so this would go on and on for several weeks. And one of the most distressing aspects of these human sacrifices is that as she did more and more and more of them, Magdalena got it in her head that beating the sacrifice to death before consuming their blood was spoiling the blood in some way. And so what she began doing was she would have the other villagers beat the sacrifice into submission, and then she would have the sacrifice strung up to one of the pikes while they were still alive, and then she would carve their heart out while they were alive, and then she would drink their blood. So in May of 1963, when Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, when he poked his head around and looked into that cave, he watched one of these sacrifices having their heart cut out. And he didn't know what to make of it, and so he ran to the police, and then the next day, he and the police officer, Luis Martinez, they would go back to the cave, and Magdalena and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave, and both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. They would have their hearts cut out, and Magdalena would drink their blood. When the police and army arrived in La Yerba Buena, it was a ghost town because all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons because Magdalena probably knew there was going to be a big police response because one of their officers has gone missing out here. They're bound to be found out. And so when the police and the army reached the cave, there's this big shootout with all of the villagers. And during the shootout, the majority of the villagers are killed. Also, the Hernandez brothers, they're also killed in the shootout. And then after the shootout stops, the police and the army would go into this cave and they would discover the pikes, the bloody pikes that are in the back of the cave with bits of human remains all over the ground. And then they would leave the cave and they would search the town and they would find the remains of Luis and Sebastian outside a particular shack. And then inside the shack was Magdalena and her brother Eliezer. They were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities, and so they would be arrested. It's believed Magdalena sacrificed and drank the blood of at least 15 of the villagers over a 6-week period. However, the only remains to be positively identified were Luis Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero. Ultimately, Magdalena and her brother Eliezer were sentenced to 50 years in prison, and all of the surviving villagers who participated in these sacrifices or who participated in the shootout with police and the army, they were given 30 years in prison. Amazingly, none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother, despite the fact they were almost certainly offered reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Clearly, they were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. Although the exact date of when this happened is not known, Magdalena would eventually die behind bars. Before Herb Baumeister would become a prolific, horrible serial killer, he was a pillar of his community. He was a doting father. He was a loving husband. His neighbors enjoyed spending time with him because he was high energy and he threw great parties. But what people didn't know from outward appearances is that he was schizophrenic and had been diagnosed at a young age. He also had this deep obsession with death and dying that he could never quite shake. His morbid obsession would ultimately take over, and he would go on to end the lives of nearly 24 young men in Indiana. And he would bury the majority of them on his property, which was known as Fox Hollow Farm. When an investigation into all these missing young men in Indiana points at Herb Baumeister being the primary suspect, Baumeister flees his property and ultimately ends his own life. And in the note he leaves, he just says that the reason he's taking his own life is because his business is failing and so is his marriage. He doesn't confess to any of the murders. He doesn't give investigators any indication of how many people he killed or where they are. He didn't give any closure to anyone. He just took his own life, and that was that. And so while investigators did a very thorough search of the property that Baumeister owned, the Fox Hollow Farms property, and found over 5,000 human bone fragments and were able to identify a number of victims, they believe that there are more victims buried at Fox Hollow Farms that we may never uncover. So our story picks up over a decade later when two new owners come in, purchase Fox Hollow Farms, and almost immediately some very strange things start happening in and around the property. Then they record this very famous audio recording inside the property, which that in conjunction with the other strange things that they had seen around the property leads them to believe that Fox Hollow Farms is haunted. So before we get into their story and we listen to that audio recording, if you're interested in strange, dark, and mysterious content like what I'm promising on today's episode, then you've come to the right place, because this is the type of content that I produce 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that interests you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these uploads every week. So let's dive in. In 2006, Rob, Vicky Graves, and their 2 teenage sons were tired of living the city, fast-paced lifestyle and decided to look for some property in suburban Indiana where they could kind of escape that busy lifestyle. And so when they were looking at real estate in some of the nicer suburbs of Indiana, they found this one property called Fox Hollow Farms that was this huge sprawling estate but was selling for some unbelievably cheap price. And so they contact a real estate agent who says, yeah, we'd love to give you a tour of the place. It's up for sale. No one's occupying it right now. It's owned by an investor, but they are looking to sell, obviously. So yeah, let's do a house tour. And so they're open-minded. It seems too good to be true, but they decide, you know what, we'll go take a look. And so they get to this property, and it's beautiful. It is everything they wanted this dream home they're looking for to be. You know, it has an indoor swimming pool, it's got loads of bedrooms and bathrooms, it's like basically a mansion. And as they're walking around the property, Rob is speaking to his wife, Vicky, and they're both kind of going back and forth like, what's wrong with this place? This doesn't make any sense. Rob starts to wonder, wait a second, I think I've heard of this place on TV before. And he's having like an epiphany. And he's like, I think that this could actually be the home of one of the most notorious serial killers in Indiana's history, Herb Baumeister. It's like it just came to him that the name Fox Hollow Farm was something he remembered hearing on TV. And so he stops the real estate agent on their tour and he says, hey, this is a beautiful home, but is this the home of Herb Baumeister? And the real estate agent, almost expecting this to be brought up, was like, yes, that's why it's still on the market. People are unwilling to purchase this home, even though the investor who scooped this up in the 90s following the tragedy that was the Herb Baumeister case, the investor had basically gutted the whole residence and basically removed all the kind of remnants of what it used to look like when Herb Baumeister was living there. Nobody wanted it because, you know, Herb Baumeister had killed nearly 24 young men and buried them on the property, and investigators still were finding pieces of bone on the property, and they didn't really know how many victims there were. And so it was this kind of spooky place to live. And so the real estate agent just said, that's why it's so cheap. The property's beautiful, it's well kept, but no one wants to be here because of the history. The real estate agent says, here, why don't you and your wife just go talk about it? We can leave if you guys aren't comfortable with this. Ultimately, they decide to purchase the property. So a couple weeks later, Rob and Vicky and their 2 teenage sons move into Fox Hollow Farms, and they love it. And especially their 2 teenage sons love swimming in the pool. And they had gotten in the habit of basically running around outside and then tracking in dirt and gravel into the swimming pool. And so one day, Vicky is vacuuming up some of this dirt and gravel that had gotten inside of the area around the pool. And so she's vacuuming up the gravel, and all of a sudden her vacuum cuts out. And in fact, the power cord where the vacuum was attached to had come undone. And so she thinks, oh, I must have, yanked on the cord and pulled it out of the outlet. And so she goes over and she plugs it back in, and she goes back to vacuuming up the gravel that was in the pool. And so as she's doing that, it goes out again, which surprised her because she remembered thinking to herself, like, don't yank on the cord because you just unplugged it. And she turns around, and now the cord from the vacuum and the outlet it was plugged into are separated by about a foot. That it was as if it had been like yanked out pretty hard. And she's thinking to herself, like, did I just yank on it again? Like, am I wrapped on a chair or something? Like, how did I yank it out, and how did it move a foot away from the outlet? And so after she plugs it in, she checks it and kind of yanks on it to make sure it's not falling out on its own. Like, it's not a kind of weak connection to the port. And it's not. It's in there secure. And she goes back to vacuuming, and she's looking over her shoulder and checking the outlet as she's vacuuming, like wondering, like, what was causing it to pop out of the socket like that. And as she's looking at it, she watches it pop out of the socket again, except it didn't just fall to the ground. It like jumped out, as if there was a surge of electricity that popped it out of the socket or something. And she drops the vacuum because it startled her, and she didn't know what to make of it. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees, Joe, was chronically late. And it got to the point where Rob's like, Joe, what's going on? Like, why are you always late? And Joe said, I live over an hour away, and I can't get here on time. I got to find somewhere, to live that's closer to the dealership. And Rob is like, well, actually, we have an entire apartment attached to our residence at Fox Hollow Farms that no one's staying in. We'd be happy to let you rent that out. It's right down the road. And Joe's like, actually, that sounds pretty great. And so just a couple days later, Rob helps Joe move into the new apartment. And they spend the whole day moving all the boxes and furniture in there. And just in the span of just a few hours, they move everything into Joe's apartment. Rob leaves. Joe is exhausted. It's just he and his dog, Fred. And Joe just decides to crash for the night, and he lays down in the bed and falls asleep. And so that night, he has this dream where he's being chased by someone. He doesn't know what it is, but it causes him to actually act out his dream, like sleepwalk. He jumps up out of his bed and starts running as if he needs to escape the apartment, but he's like kind of half dreaming, and he runs into the door frame, falls to the ground, knocks a glass over, and actually cuts his hands up pretty bad. And so he like comes to, and he's like looking around, and he's like, what was that? So a couple days later, Vicky comes home, and she finds Rob painting the side of the house. And she and Rob stop and are talking about how beautiful it's going to look when the painting's done. And out of the corner of her eye, Vicky sees something in the forest that was on the edge of their property. And it was actually a man standing with a red t-shirt on, just standing like looking at their property. And as she's looking at him, he turns around and he starts walking away farther into the forest. And so she kind of looks, and before she says anything to Rob, the guy has just vanished into the woods. And so she just goes, Rob, I just saw someone standing on our property. He had a red shirt on, and he was right over there. And Rob immediately is like, well, honestly, we moved into a serial killer's house. We should accept that there's going to be people that are just going to want to sneak onto our property to get a look at this building. And so they walk over to where Vicky has seen this guy in red, and they look, and there's no one there. They yell out like, hey, is anybody here? And no one's there. And so even though it was pretty unsettling, Vicky and Rob just decide that I guess this is a reality of living here, is that you're going to have people spying on you a little bit because of the notoriety of the home. So later that night, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some dishes, and it's late at night, probably like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and he hears a knock on the door. And he's literally mid-dishes, his hands are wet, and so he turns off the water and he yells out, hey, just a second, and he starts toweling off his hands, and as he's doing that, the knocking gets louder and more aggressive, and he's like, hey, hold on, I'm just drying my hands off, hold on. and he assumes it's Vicky or Rob. And so he starts walking over, and the knocking is just incessant. And he finally opens the door, and no one's there. It wasn't like the knocking was going on and stopped, and then he went over there and opened it. It was literally like the knocking was happening as he's opening the door, and no one is standing there. He's like immediately on guard. Like, okay, is someone like on the roof, like bending down? Is someone hiding? Like, what's going on? And he kind of pokes his head out and he's looking around, and he actually steps out onto the front steps there, and he's looking around, and he figured like if someone had knocked, they'd be running away if they're gone already, and he can't hear anything. It's just silent. There's no one there. And then he goes back into his apartment, shuts it, bolts the door shut, and out of the corner of his eye, he spots what looks like a man in his bedroom, basically just walking past the door frame into his bedroom. And it totally startles him. His dog starts growling and looking in the direction of the bedroom. And so he walks over there and looks in his bedroom, and there's nothing there. He flips on all the lights, he looks around, and he's like, what's going on here? Like, it totally scared him. So Joe had only been in this apartment for about 3 weeks, and one of the things he had kind of developed a habit doing was in the evenings he would take his dog Fred for a walk along the driveway that was, well lit, and the driveway was pretty long. It's a big piece of property, and he would take his dog up to the end of the driveway and then walk back. And because of what he's just witnessed with the knocking on the door and what looked like someone in his apartment, he decides he just wants to clear his head and go on a walk with his dog. And he figured he could maybe swing by the main house and see if the lights were on in Rob and Vicky's house, because in some way, maybe if their lights were on, it would indicate that maybe they had been over and had been knocking on his door, and tomorrow he'll find out what it was about. Like, he's searching for a way to rationalize this. And he notices right away that Vicky and Rob's house is totally dark. They're asleep. He doesn't make it very far when his dog stops. The dog starts taking off into the tree line. And before Joe actually takes off after his dog, he looks up and he breaks out through some of the lighting over the driveway that there is a man in red with a red t-shirt that's at the edge of the forest. And his back is turned and he's walking into the forest, and as Joe's looking, it looks like the man in red actually disappears. And so the dog is heading straight for this man in red, and so Joe, because it's his dog, he loves his dog, he starts running after the dog, even though he's absolutely terrified of what's going to happen here. He couldn't let his dog get harmed. So he chases into the woods, makes it like a few feet into the woods, where he finds his dog that's now not barking and is actually facing back out at Joe, and it's kind of cowering, looking at where Joe is now standing. And Joe kind of begins to turn, and the man in red is standing right next to him, looking directly at Joe. And Joe just panics and starts running out, doesn't stop to do anything. The dog follows Joe, and they run back to Joe's apartment, run upstairs, shut the doors, shut the blinds, lock everything, and they just sit there. For the rest of the night, Joe is literally checking his window and looking outside, because he doesn't know if he just saw that or not, because that person in red had vanished a minute ago. He thought that perhaps he was convincing himself that he saw someone in red because he had just seen like a ghost in his apartment like a few minutes earlier, and he's starting to think that maybe he's just kind of hallucinating all this stuff, or that he's imagining all this stuff. So he wasn't quite prepared to go tell Rob and Vicky or do anything about it. So he just spent the night basically looking out his window and making sure no one was coming into his residence again. And so the next morning, he goes and tells Rob and Vicky what happened the night before. Everything from the knocking on the door to the person that he thought he saw inside of his apartment, to then ultimately the man in red that his dog chased after. As he's telling them about this exchange with the man in red, Vicky is getting pretty emotional. And Vicky is like, I saw a man in red. And she points to the area of their property, and it's the same area that Joe had just been describing where this had all happened. She was like, I saw a man in red right over there. Like, what's going on? So that night, Joe is in his apartment, and Joe is definitely on edge about what had happened the night before. He's increasingly almost listening for noises outside because of how scary the night before was. And he forgoes his walk on the driveway with his dog. I think he's pretty much done doing that after that encounter. And as he's in his apartment, he hears knocking on the door again. And he yells, who is it? Who's at the door? And no answer, but the knocking continues. And it's one of those knockers. It's the actual knocker on the outside of the door that's being hit over and over again. He can see the door actually shaking from how hard this is being banged against the door. And finally, after like poking his head out and seeing no one, he rips the door open and no one's there. and he looks at the door itself, and the knocker is perpendicular to the ground, like someone's holding it up, but no one's there. And as he's looking at it, it swings down and knocks the door one last time. He slams the door shut, locks it, and he's absolutely petrified. He sees the doorknob on the door start to turn. He can hear the sound of the spring tightening as the doorknob slowly turns all the way over into the open position. The door's locked, but the doorknob's been twisted. And he's looking at the door, and then there's silence after the doorknob's being held in the, call it, open position. And then all of a sudden it bursts open, breaking the lock. No one's outside. And he looks at it and he's absolutely frozen for a second. And then he just runs out of his apartment to see who is doing this. No one's there. When he turns around and looks into his apartment, he sees a man in white, not in red, who is soaked head to toe, screaming and running towards him, who runs out of the apartment past him and vanishes into the air. And so he takes off. Joe, he's not sticking around, grabs his dog, runs to Rob and Vicky's, and he goes in and tells them what happened. Joe, Rob, and Vicky are so scared that now they're not trying to rationalize that this wasn't a ghost, let's say. They're trying to convince themselves that this is a friendly ghost, that these are the victims of Herbert Baumeister that have been tormented by Baumeister, but they're here because they're trapped here. That man you saw in your apartment, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister, escaping from Herbert Baumeister. The man in red, that was a victim of Herbert Baumeister. We're dealing with the victims here because so many people had their lives snuffed out here. And so it isn't really calming them, but it's like they're creating a narrative that fits what's happening. Because without a story, this is impossible to understand. And so they really start to believe that what they're experiencing is a haunting, but it is of Herb Baumeister's victims basically acting out their final moments or kind of leading them to what happened to these victims. And so that night, Joe, Rob, and Vicky start going online and researching who the victims were, the known victims of Herb Baumeister. And there's images of all of these different victims. And as they're scrolling through all the pictures, Joe stops them on one and he goes, "That's the guy that was in my apartment. It looks exactly like the guy that was soaking wet, screaming, that ran out of my apartment." Like, that confirms, this is a confirmation to the three of them, that the entity they're experiencing in this property is definitely the victim. So they do feel reassured at this point, scared, but reassured that these are the victims. And so they start really aggressively researching the Baumeister case, and they come to realize that there's actually a number of victims, more than likely, that have not been uncovered, that have been buried on this property, only lending in their mind more credibility to the idea that this is a property that is haunted by the victims of Herb Baumeister. And so after a couple of days where there isn't much activity, Joe decides to go for a walk in the woods in the same area where the man in red had been seen by Vicky and by himself a couple days earlier. And he just decides, in broad daylight, I'm going to go for a walk with my dog out in the woods. And so he starts walking in that direction, and literally sitting on the leaves, like practically on the trail in plain sight, is a human bone. It's a femur bone just sitting on the trail. Like, the idea that that bone wouldn't have been located during the extensive search for bones on this property is nearly impossible. To Joe, the way he described it is, I feel like that bone was left there for me to discover it. That the man in red, who was more than likely a victim of Herb Baumeister, had led me to finding that bone. And so they believe, Joe, Rob, and Vicky, that when they send this bone in for forensic analysis, that they'll determine that this was another victim that perhaps hasn't been identified yet. And they're kind of expecting it to be the man in red, whoever that was. And so Rob ends up calling the lead detective from the Baumeister case and says, "Hey, we found a bone." And so they submit that and they take it in as evidence. And Rob asks the lead investigator if he would mind coming to the property and just kind of explaining to them, where things occurred on the property relative to the Baumeister case. Where did all the tragedy unfold? Like, where were people buried? Just to give us a sense of what we're dealing with here. And so the investigator agrees, and the investigator comes out, and the vast majority of the killings happened in the swimming pool, where Baumeister would basically lure young men to come to his property to go swimming. And as soon as they got in the pool, he would strangle them to death. And the weird thing about the pool area is that Baumeister was, well, a psychopath, and he had put mannequins all over the inside of this swimming pool that had like party outfits on. And so there are these very eerie pictures of the swimming pool with like mannequins all around the outside, and it was basically a place where he lured his victims and ended their lives. A couple days later, Joe is in his apartment, and he's doing some work at his computer, and he hears a metallic scraping sound coming from his kitchen. And so he goes over to his kitchen and he finds that all of the knives that were in his butcher's block have been pulled out and lined up neatly in the bottom of his sink, like very neatly arranged. And he's looking at it like, I didn't do that. And he turns towards his workstation, like as if to like look around the room, and he notices on the island that sits where he was standing right in front of him, a little bit low down, like halfway up the island, there was all these fresh cut marks in the wood, like a number of cut marks across the wood. And he's looking at that and he's thinking to himself, is this one of the victims telling me that, perhaps they had been attacked with a knife right here in the kitchen? He's thinking like it's his duty to try to figure out which victim this was and what happened to them. And so he gets his iPhone out and he turns on the voice recorder and he starts recording and asking some questions of the room. And he first make sure to turn off the TV, turn off the AC so it's quiet. And so with his recorder, he starts asking, like, who's anybody here? And there's silence. And he's like, who was the person in the kitchen? Who was walking through the kitchen? And there's silence. And then when he asks again about was there anybody in the kitchen, his dog starts growling and reacting to something in the room. And now Joe hasn't heard anything. He's not heard any confirmation that there's someone in the room. He actually felt quite silly doing it. He takes his phone back to his computer because he takes his dog growling as maybe somehow confirmation that there was something there, and he downloads the audio file and he listens to it. And as he's listening to the file, right after he asks about is there anybody in the kitchen, he gets a response.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
Who's in the kitchen? The married one. And so as Joe is looking through all their files, he's seeing that every single victim was single. No one's married. They're all young men who are single. The only one who was married, involved in this case, was none other than the serial killer himself, Herb Baumeister. And so Joe has had this revelation, and it's when he realizes that it's not just the victims here. Herb Baumeister, the serial killer himself, is haunting this property. So I'd love to hear what you think is going on at Fox Hollow Farm, whether this is a haunting with Herb Baumeister himself showing himself and speaking on audio files, or if this is just a big hoax. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to get in touch with me, please direct message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen over there as well. And again, if you haven't already, please gently assassinate the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss my 3 to 4 weekly uploads that look and sound an awful lot like this one. That's going to do it, guys. Thank you very much, guys, for sticking around till the very end, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please put a metal fork in the 5-star review button's microwave, set it for 99 minutes, hit start, and then leave their house. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly,